Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today, I'm here with Matthieu Lavagna, right? I got your last name right? Nice. And
Right.
Christopher, wait, did I get it right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, just trying to make sure because I remember I used to get Christopher Tomaszewski's last name wrong all the time. So now I got it fixed. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for coming out to my show today. I think I'll just have you briefly introduce yourselves again because I know that you've been publishing work, you've been doing all sorts of things in the Catholic and just in general the philosophical world. So it'd be good to just kind of get an update on what's going on. So let me have Matthieu go first, and then Christopher.
Right. So thank you for having me, Suan, and thank you, Chris, for participating tonight. So I'm a French Catholic apologist. I've also lived in America from 2007 to 2011. So this is where I learned English. And so, yeah, I've been working as an apologist at the beginning of September this year. So it's fairly recent. My first book is coming out in January, and I'm writing a second book on abortion and pro-life apologetics. So yeah, this is really nice, and I've been really interested in natural law theory, reading guys like Edward Fraser and some of Tomaszewski's work online, at least, and yeah, other natural law theorists such as Brian B. Song. I've talked to him a lot. And I generally find natural law theory very convincing and interesting as a general theory of morality. And yeah, I pretty much agree with the thesis that the end very rarely justify the means. And I think there are a few counterexamples to this in what I call tough cases. And even many Catholic theologians would agree with me on some of those tough cases. And so what I call tough cases would be some examples so I have 5 tough cases I want to bring up in this talk. So one would be cases of lying in extreme cases. I will present the cases later. Some exceptions for torture, some for contraception, and another controversial topic on the adoption of frozen embryos. And finally, a rare case on suicide, where I think it would be permissible. Mm-hmm. And so I can present to start. I can present the first one whenever you want.
Yeah, let me have Christopher introduce himself real quick.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So yeah, thanks for having me on, Suan, and Matthieu. Thanks for having this chat with me. So I think the last time I was on your channel, Suan, I was still back at Baylor. I have now since moved on from Baylor, mm-hmm. At least physically. I'm now an assistant professor of philosophy at Belmont Abbey College. So I'm getting to teach a lot more than I did in the past, including getting to be involved in the human and academic formation of the seminarians of the Diocese of Charlotte, which has been a joy. All my students have been a joy, but that in particular has been a great joy to me. Very happy with all that. For your listeners, your viewers who may not have seen my previous appearances on your channel, I mostly work in metaphysics, natural theology, and medieval philosophy, especially applications of St. Thomas's work to problems in contemporary metaphysics. A lot of my public-facing interactions of late have concerned a doctrine of divine simplicity, but I've also appeared on your channel to defend Catholicism, mm-hmm. and a few other things I can't remember at all. And yeah, are we talking now about, are we jumping now into why we like natural law?
Yeah, sure. I think that'd be a good kind of launching point. And just I think Christopher, the last time you're on my show, it was with David Bradshaw on Palimism and Thomism. Yeah, so that was a pretty epic conversation.
Yeah. Right, like I mentioned, I'm primarily a metaphysician, so ethics and action theory that areas of philosophy surrounding natural law theory are not really my area of specialization. But given my general Thomist inclinations in metaphysics and the way in which the relevant metaphysics fits together with the relevant action theory and ethics, I certainly count myself as a natural law theorist and count myself as a traditional Thomist natural law theorist. I think there are serious problems bordering on incoherence with new natural law theory of the sort that has been defended by Robert George and Finnis and sorry, who's the other one?
Germain.
Sorry.
Isn't his last name Grisey or something like that? Or
right, Grisey. Yeah, Grisey, who's the founder, I would say, I think everybody would say, of new natural law theory. So I don't like new natural law theory at all. Lots of the things that new natural lawyers have said, I think are just totally unacceptable from an ethical point of view. I like old-fashioned Thomistic natural law theory. In particular, again, because of the way I think it represents an ethical view that fits hand in glove with St. Thomas's metaphysics. That, to me at least, represents a distinctive theoretical advantage over other ethical theories that are more detached from their metaphysical foundations. The unity of St. Thomas's metaphysics with his natural law theory, I think, is a indication. The way in which they fit so naturally together is an indication that both are true. And so that's, as a metaphysician, that's a great deal of the appeal for me of natural law theory.
Yeah, well, I'll just go on really quick to just say that a lot of my research right now is just concerning, early Christianity and Judaism. And so this ethics and metaphysics were usually my main area of interest until about now. And so I've been kind of going back and forth. And so I'm hoping that I can just be helpful in this conversation. People kind of joke about how like Bill Nye isn't really a scientist because he's an engineer or something like that. And he's commenting about age of the earth and all these other things. Well, I hope that I can be a good Bill Nye for this discussion, so to speak. So, so why do I like natural law theory? Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I like natural law theory is exactly what Christopher said, which is that it fits so well with Aquinas' system. And for the most part, I don't really have any qualms with Aquinas' metaphysics. I think it just makes very beautiful sense of the world. It has a comprehensive kind of take on reality. And I do find, the arguments for God from St. Thomas's work very convincing. I think another thing that I like about Aquinas' natural law theory and even Aristotle's, ethics is that the goal of both, men, their goal was to create an ethical system that was scientific, right? So it's coherent. It is, giving you laws about nature and reality. You can observe, the conditions for human flourishing, identify the good, and, the system doesn't have a genuine clash of rights where, you usually say that rights are absolute, and then you have these two rights clashing together. Oh, one right cancels out the other. It becomes a very arbitrary, ugly system, So I like how it presents ethics as the science of how to fulfill human nature. And so part of, Aquinas' system and even, of Augustine and the other fathers was this idea that, being and goodness are convertible, right? So wherever there's being or the fullness of reality, that's where goodness is, so to speak. And it can even start off as just non-moral goodness. There's something, there's goodness there. Now, badness would be the privation of being. I think we all agree on that, right? And so as you go along and then you get to human beings with their capacity for practical reason, they can identify the good, and then they can make laws or principles or how they best go about pursuing that good. And so, we can think about human nature, observe how humans tend to act, and we can see that, these tendencies in human nature aren't arbitrary. They are, as Aristotle said, every man acts for what he takes to be good, right? So there's a reason behind the action in place, and that reason is the final end, or the telos, and that if the action fulfills the telos properly, then you get the fullness of being and you get goodness. And so I find that system very coherent, very plausible. And even a lot of ethicists that I've read who don't identify as natural law theorists, they will borrow heavily from Aristotle in some way, some capacity. They'll talk about how, man, I think we need teleology in our system, you know, or something like that. And it's like, yeah, you probably do. But anyway, going to Matthieu now, talking about what you like about natural law. Mm-hmm.
You pretty much summarized it very well. I don't think you can have a coherent, a good theory of morality without using intrinsic teleology. I think this gets you nowhere. And I really like the realism behind natural law theory. It's just using the natural principles of reason in terms of intrinsic teleology and what our organs are for, and this helps you to reason very well when it comes to the ethics of sex, or ethics in general. I don't like consequentialist theories. I'm not a consequentialist. I'm just saying that right now because so that no one doubts about it. I think you just summarized it very well. I have nothing to add more.
All right, well, Matthieu, I'm ready to hear the first of the 5 cases, so go ahead, present it, and then we'll proceed from there.
So the first one that would come to mind would be lying. So I agree with the general principle that lying is wrong because our speech is naturally ordered towards speaking the truth, because the purpose of language is to aim at truth, and that's what language is made for. So in terms of teleology, Aquinas is totally right on that. However, I think there are some exceptions, and I bring up the famous case that everyone knows about, is should you lie to a Nazi officer that comes to knock at the door, asking you if there are Jews in your attic? And I would say that not only is it permissible to lie in this case, I think it might also be a moral obligation to tell a falsehood to this officer in order to maximize the chances he won't go look in your attic. And so I like the 1992 definition of lying that the Catechism gives. So in the original version, it defined lying as the following way. So to lie is to speak or act against truth in order to lead into error someone who has the right to know the truth. So the very important part of this definition is the right to know the truth. And so if this definition of lying is accepted, then I think that lying is never permissible, because the Nazi officer in question wouldn't have the right to know the truth. However, this definition was later changed, and lying was just to tell a falsehood in order to lead someone into error. And I think that with this definition of lying, there are a few self-evident exceptions, like lying in order to save a Jew, and this is what, by the way, Pius XII did that when he accepted to make false baptism certificates in order to save the Jews. I don't think Pius XII was a modernist or a consequentialist, and he actually did lie in order to save Jews. So, I mean, of course, you could say that popes are only infallible when they speak ex cathedra, and that's just a pastoral mistake. But I don't think this was a pastoral mistake. I mean, saving Jews, even though it involved making false baptism certificates, seems clearly like a good moral action from a moral intuition. So yes, I would say that on lying. And I would also add that the question has not been settled in the Church Fathers. The Church Fathers disagreed with each other on this question. John Henry Newman said later, it's not settled. And still ethicists today like Christopher Kaiser, Hadley Arcus, or Peter Knift and Janet Smith all argue that lying is permissible in certain circumstances. So I'm not definitely the only one defending this. There are a lot of good, intelligent Catholic theologians who are defending the same position.
Well, yeah, Christopher, do you want to start with questions, or do you want me to go, or how do you want to do this?
I have a lot of things to say, but let me start with this. So Matthieu, when you say that there are some exceptions against there are some exceptions to the general norm against lying, do you mean to say that lying is not intrinsically evil, or do you mean to say that it's sometimes permissible to do intrinsically evil things?
It depends on how you define intrinsically evil.
Right. Well, I don't know. Let's start with whatever definition you like. Why don't you tell me what you mean by it?
Well, I would say that an action is intrinsically evil if it's contrary to its natural end. What do you think of that?
So is the definition, an action is intrinsically evil if it's contrary to the natural end of the agent?
Yeah, of what it's for. So like homosexuality is intrinsically evil because it's contrary to the natural end of sex, one end being procreation. And so it would be intrinsically disordered.
Good. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that's fine as a first pass. So then, okay. So then given that definition, what are we saying about lying? That it's not intrinsically evil, or that it is intrinsically evil, but nevertheless still sometimes permissible?
So I would distinguish being of an action being intrinsically disordered and intrinsically evil, because not all disorders are metaphysical evil, but not moral evil. Yeah, I think there's a distinction to be made between something that is bad in itself and something that is sinful. So I don't think that all ontologically bad actions are sinful. So like you could say that lying is ontologically bad insofar as it perverts the faculty of speech that is ordered towards truth, but it's not a sin insofar as it's not a moral evil.
So is lying then is it a disordered action? Is it always a disordered action?
It depends what definition you take. If you take the 1992 definition of the Catechism, then no. Like I would agree with the 1992 definition that it's never permissible. But with the modern definition, well, the new definition in the Catechism, I would say that it is intrinsically disordered. But yeah, I don't know.
So
I haven't thought.
So I guess here's one worry that I have, like right off the bat, is that it sounds like, and you can correct me if this is not a good interpretation of what you said, you want to sometimes say that there can be disorder without sin, an ontological perhaps disorder without sin. But the problem, I guess, as I see it, is the ontological disorder is a disorder in the will. And right, so it's not just sorry, the ontological disorder is a disorder in the will, right? So normally the way in which we distinguish, as you call it, metaphysical evil from moral evil is by locating that evil either inside or outside of the will of some rational, intelligent agent. So if a tree's roots wither and it begins to die, there is some kind of metaphysical evil insofar as the tree is no longer able to reach its ends and become a good tree. But there is no moral evil because the evil in question is not located in the will of any intelligent agent. So, I mean, this goes back, I guess, to what I was saying about why I like natural law theory. Is there's this it's very easy to see how the theory fits in with Aquinas' overall metaphysics, right? Like you come up with this theory of what evil is, and then you just say, Okay, and the moral evils are just a special subset of the metaphysical evils that are found in the wills of rational agents.
Yes.
So I guess I don't see how we can square the idea that there could be disorder in the will, that I could deliberately choose a disordered action and thereby introduce disorder in my will, but not be guilty of wrongdoing, not be engaged in moral evil.
But your will in this case is to save someone from death, and so your will is not oriented towards sinning.
Yeah, it's oriented towards saving someone from death, but it's also oriented to lying. I don't object to the saving someone from death part. Nobody objects to that, right? The problem is it's along with the volition of the end to save someone from death, I have also chosen a certain means, lying, to accomplish that end, and
Yes.
The disorder arises from the lying.
But the question is that disorder acceptable for to save an innocent person's life?
Right.
Because it's a small disorder. Like it's not the same kind of disorder that you have in homosexual acts, for example, or so there are different kinds of disorders. There's a whole hierarchy.
What do you mean when you say it's not the same kind of disorder as we find in homosexual acts?
I'm saying that there are disorders that are more evil than others, that have
Sure.
Yeah. So
right. Okay. So I mean, here's something I guess I would want to get straight on is like, yeah, of course there are disorders that are more disordered than other disorders, and are therefore graver evils than those other disorders. But I wouldn't want to have us get confused between something's being gravely evil and being intrinsically evil. These are two very different things, right? So to say that something is intrinsically evil in and of itself is neutral with respect to how grave that evil is. So lying historically in the tradition has been understood to be an intrinsic evil, but absent some aggravating circumstances, it's also been understood to be a generically venial or slight evil. So, lying to the Nazis at a door would be a sin on the standard Thomistic tradition, on the standard Catholic tradition, but it would be a venial sin, and it would be a venial sin for at least two reasons. One, that in the absence of some kind of injustice being perpetuated by the lie, we standardly say that lying is venial, but also because of the beneficent motive for the lie also attenuates the gravity of the sin. But none of that is in tension with the judgment that lying is intrinsically evil, right? It could be, you could say that the evil is as slight as you want, right? I mean, it doesn't really make any, I don't think it really matters in the end how slight you judge the evil to be. No matter how slight you may judge the evil to be, that's consistent with its being intrinsically, or it might be better to say essentially evil.
Yeah, and I would agree with you that it's never permissible to make even a venial sin. Like it's never permissible to sin independently of the circumstances, and therefore I wouldn't say it's a venial sin to lie to a Nazi officer. Same thing for spying. I wouldn't say that spying is sinful, even though you're intentionally trying to deceive your enemies by saying we're going to attack at 9 instead of at 8. That would be a kind of disorder, if you want, that is to me self-evidently permissible. And sometimes necessary to win a war. You need spies who lie to win a war. And it's weird that we don't have the church speaking about the immorality of spying. That's something to note. I mean,
well, I guess let me just say, first of all, I agree with you that it's it's weird that the church has not had things to say about lying in the context of spying, and also in the context and also in the context of undercover police work. I actually think that the church should speak out about those things. With that said, spying and undercover police work in the way that we know them now have really only become very widespread practices in the 20th century, when the church has unfortunately been putting out much bigger fires, unfortunately. But with that said, I mean, I also don't, I guess I wouldn't want Suan's listeners to think that the church hasn't at least indirectly spoken about this, because in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2485, she says that by its very nature, lying is to be condemned. And what it means to say that something is to be condemned by its very nature is to say that it is essentially or intrinsically evil. So that is the teaching of the church, at least. What constitutes a lie has been a subject of debate. For those of Suan's listeners who want to dive in deeper on this, there was a very intriguing debate on Pints with Aquinas between Father Gregory Pine and Dr. Janet Smith, with Father Pine taking the position that the traditional Thomistic position that lying is to speak contrary to the mind, and Dr. Smith taking, I think, the position closer to what the 1992 Catechism had said, that it has to do with whether one has the right to the truth. Although I think there was a reason that was corrected to come to this point. There was a reason that was fixed. People who were responsible for the catechism saw a problem with it. And the problem with it is that it ignores the specific malice of lying. So when I lie to someone who deserves the truth, so take, for example, the case of a witness lying to a judge or jury, or the case of a child lying to a parent, there we're not just dealing with lying, we're also dealing with a species of injustice where something that is owed to the other has been denied him. But it's important to note that that is accidental to lying, right? It's accidental to lying that it also constitutes a kind of injustice by which we deny what is owed to another. It's not essential to lying, right? So if someone just asked me, for example, the common example, if my wife asked me if she looks good in this dress, or to take your example, if the Nazis come to the door and ask me whether I have any Jews, I'm now in a situation where lying would not constitute any kind of injustice. I don't owe my wife the truth concerning whether she looks good in that dress. Nor do I owe, for example, a stranger on the street the truth about how I'm doing today. And so I might lie and say I'm doing fine, even if I'm quite miserable. And I don't owe the Nazi at the door the truth about whether I have any Jews in the house, because he doesn't have any right to that information. And furthermore, I know that he intends to use it for an evil purpose. So there we would be dealing with cases where by lying, I would not be committing any injustice. That's correct, yes. But nobody who has ever upheld the traditional view about the intrinsic evil of lying has thought that what made lying intrinsically evil is its injustice, right? It's not the injustice, it's the frustration of the natural faculty, right? And so when I lie to the Nazi at the door, or I lie to my wife about whether she looks good in that dress, or I lie to the stranger about how I'm doing today, what I've done is, on the traditional view, not wrong because I have done those people some injustice, but wrong simply because I have frustrated the natural faculty of thought and speech. Let me give a little bit of an analogy just to illustrate the distinction I'm trying to make. Another kind of act that is condemned by the church as intrinsically evil is contraception. And I think that might be one of the other five cases you intend to discuss later. So I guess we'll circle back around to this at some point. But the reason that the church condemns contraception as evil is not that offspring is owed to the sexual partner, right? It's not because like the person with whom I have sex when I contracept, I owe them a child or something like that, right? That's not the church's understanding of what makes contraception wrong. Rather, it's a frustration of the natural faculty. It's not about injustice done to the sexual partner or anything like that, although a dimension of that might be present in marital cases. But that's not what essentially makes contraception wrong. It's the frustration of the natural faculty. So we can distinguish here, right, between sometimes accidentally lying constitutes a distinct species of injustice, but we should not confuse that with the essential malice of lying. We should not confuse that with what essentially makes lying morally and theologically wrong, because what makes lying essentially morally and theologically wrong is the frustration of the natural faculty.
Yeah, let me get Matthieu just to give kind of an equally thorough response. And then I do have a few comments I'd like to make, and then we'll see if we want to move on or stick on this for a little bit. But yeah, go ahead, Matthieu, give as much as you can a response to what Christopher just said.
Yeah, so it would be just like a question. Do you agree? Do you think that spies are lying, are sinning when they tell falsehoods all the time?
So I just want to be careful here. I mean, I think there are permissible forms of what we would call spying, going into another country and collecting intelligence. However, I think that what most people who are involved in non-official covert operations for the CIA are involved in does almost invariably involve lying. Yes, and I think that is sinful, absolutely, without a doubt.
And so, yeah, you agree with me that it's weird that the church hasn't condemned spying explicitly as intrinsically disordered and contrary to the natural end of speech.
Well, to be clear, as I just noted, I don't think that spying necessarily involves lying. I think and in fact, I think there have been historical cases of spying that is done without lying. You can take documents or other forms of intelligence from a foreign nation to compromise their national security in ways that don't involve telling any lies, in ways that perhaps don't involve communicating with that person at all. In fact, this is kind of what the NSA does all the time. So the CIA obviously involves placing people that they're a little bit of the, a more dramatic form of spying, right? But the NSA actually does the majority of our real spying just in terms of signals intelligence, picking up internet and cell phone activity and processing it. By doing so, the NSA is not engaged in any kind of lying, and you could certainly, I'm certainly open to the possibility that some, if not all, of what the NSA is engaged in when they're engaged in spying on people's internet or cell phone activity is permissible, at least if they had a good reason and maybe a warrant or something like that. So I don't think the absence in the church's documents of a specific condemnation of spying tells us anything about lying, because there's only a contingent relationship between the two. Although I'll acknowledge it in the kind of born identity kind of spying that primarily occupies the American imagination. There's a lot of lying going on. Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So saying things like we're attacking at 9 instead of attacking at 8, that would be unacceptable to you.
If a military leader deliberately sent some kind of communication, say by text message or email or telegram to an opposing military leader, indicating that he had an intention of attacking when he had no such intention, that would be a lie, and I condemn it. Yeah.
And suppose this is Janet Smith who brings this one up. She says that there are cases where the priest has had a very busy day, and someone comes to him and says, "Are you busy? I need some help." And the priest says no, in order to be a good shepherd, but he has had a really tough day. Do you think that he would be sinning if he really said no, knowing he was really busy and had a tough day?
No, I don't think so, because when we're trying to determine whether someone has spoken contrary to his or her mind, it's not just the surface level semantics that matter. The pragmatics also matter. So, for example, I don't want to say that actors on stage are lying, because we all understand that when we go into a theater, we do not, there is no expectation that the actors are asserting, that the actors are attempting to communicate the contents of their minds. And likewise, in the case that you raise, if I ask Father, "Are you busy?" what I really mean is, can I bother you right now, Father? Is that okay? I'm basically asking a form of permission. I'm not really asking how busy Father is, because generally, right, you can tell that this is what people are asking, because if Father had responded, "Yes, I'm extremely busy, but I can give you 5 minutes," most people who really needed it would still take it, right? They're asking a form of permission in a circumlocutionary way. They're not actually inquiring after how busy Father is today. And so when Father replies, "No, I'm not busy," what Father means is, I can help you right now. I'm happy to help you right now," which is not a lot.
Do you want to say something, Suan?
Yeah, well, I do have a few comments here and there, but I feel like Christopher kind of has expressed a lot of the contents of my mind, so to speak. Because I agree with Christopher that, especially when he described in the beginning how ontological disorder, generally speaking, has to do with things that don't have a will, right? Or even just evil acts that are done in a human being, at least at bottom, do begin with an ontological disorder. But then what makes it moral disorder or intrinsically evil is when we do talk about something with a will. And so the idea is that, it's something that an agent cannot rationally will, consistent with the teleology of the action, the structure that's there. So, for instance, Ed Fazer would call, using the perverted faculty argument, he's described things like, homosexual activity as performative self-contradictions, right? And so, like, for instance, if you have a logical system or a rational system of thought, you can't allow for contradictions, or else you get this principle of explosion, right, where everything just kind of follows, and then you lose the structure and integrity of the whole system. And so the point here is that if lying is this kind of performative self-contradiction, then it's impossible for an agent to ever rationally will to lie, right? And so that's the point that I'd make there. Matthieu, are you still there? Oh, yes. Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Christopher, but let me check, because I think Matthew's internet just kind of went out.
Right, yeah, he's frozen for me too. But I guess maybe while we're waiting for Matthieu to come back, I just wanted to add something very, very brief about, on top of what you just said, that you reminded me of, which is part of what's attractive to, at least to me, about natural law, is that part of what's attractive to me about it is as I said, the way in which the metaphysics fits with the action theory and the ethics. And a big part of that is that I think natural law and natural law alone is capable of answering the very important question: why be moral? Why be a good person? Right? Like, what's in it for me? What's in it for me to follow the moral norms and be a good person? And because natural law I think this is unique to natural law, right? It says, well, the reason to be a good person is because it constitutes the fulfillment of your own nature and the achievement of your own ends. And it's just patently irrational to not want to fulfill your own nature or to achieve your own ends in a way that, for example, I don't think it's patently irrational to not want to maximize utility or to not want to have the Kantian goodwill or anything like that. Or even for that matter, to not want to be virtuous if virtue theory isn't hooked up with a natural law understanding of what virtue is.
Yeah. Also, Matthieu, I see that we have two Matthews now in the conversation. Do you think you could close the other tab, whatever that one is?
Yeah, sorry.
No, you're good. Yeah. I just think that also, like, in the recording, it'll just kind of look weird if we have, like 4 people now in the conversation. But yeah, the other thing I wanted to say too is I think we should also discuss, for the sake of clarity, like, what we mean by a lie, what we mean by, speech acts, right? Because I think that the way that I've had, for instance, John Scalco explain it to me, and I find this pretty convincing, is that he's specifically talking about a certain kind of speech act, which is the assertion making power, right? So an assertion is you're declaring something to be the case, right? And I mean, I would add in some of my own kind of conditions into this, right? But I think one is, maybe this might be controversial, but does it have to involve another person, or could you lie to yourself? Right. So for instance, like, I might say, like, man, Suan, you are bald today. And it's like, obviously I'm not bald, but did I just like lie to myself? Would that count as, being disordered? Or does it have to be the case that I'm trying to deceive another person as well? Right. Because obviously if I lie to myself, like, Suan, you're bald, I'm looking in the mirror, like I can obviously tell that I'm not going to be deceived by that. Right. So is that a part of a condition for lying? And then let's see here. Using this assertion making power where you're trying to say that something is the case when you know or intend it to not be the case, and there involves this other aspect of deception. Do you think those are the 3 conditions for lying, Christopher or Matthieu?
So I define lying as the making of an assertion contrary to the mind. So I do think that the condition that it be an assertion is extremely important, because otherwise you get all kinds of what I might call pseudo hard cases, like the theater case, like sarcasm, et cetera, where the pragmatics of human speech, that is, right, the things which determine the meaning of speech other than the semantics of the words, are ignored in a way that ignores the dynamic of actual human conversations, where things like sarcastic jokes or acting, et cetera, obviously we don't want to count these as lies. So, for example, I think Augustine is wrong to say that the jocose lie is a sin, because I think he's wrong to think that it's a lie. Or I mean, with the caveat that I think maybe not, because it may be the case that what he has in mind with the jocose lie is a kind of practical joke lie that I think actually can be an assertion and become a lie, where you do intend to get the person to believe it for the sake of the joke. But I would distinguish that from sarcasm, that is instantly recognized as not an assertion, not assertorial, and not meant to be believed. This is, I think, something that came up between Father Pine and Dr. Smith in their debate about lying. Dr. Smith used cases like this to great effect, and I don't think any of these work because they're not assertions. They're not the kind of statements which, in their pragmatic context, constitute an attempt to get one's interlocutor to believe what one says.
Yeah, and let me jump in really quick, and don't worry, Matthew, this point might make you happy. I don't, I might be kind of boosting your point with the traditional stance, but the reason why, I asked the question on whether or not the deception condition, let's say, is necessary or maybe accidental, is because, for instance, the way that I would deal with the Nazi at my door. And I remember I told Matthew this answer. He might not have liked it, but I'm trying, So what I would say to the Nazi at my door is there are no Jewish rats in my house, right? Because technically speaking, there is no such thing as a Jewish rat. This derogatory slang term. That there's a human being, who's a Jewish person who has this intrinsic dignity, but in that term or that phraseology of calling them a Jewish rat is meant to signify something contrary to that, right? And so I would say it's technically true, right, that there are no Jewish rats in my house, right? But it's obviously with the intent to deceive the person and to mislead them, because what I mean by it, obviously, semantically speaking, is going to be different than what they mean by it. So when I say it, I mean, no, there's no such thing as a Jewish rat at all, especially not in my house. Whereas for the other person, they're going to say, oh, there are no Jews in the house, right? And it's like, well, the reason why you're deceived by it is because of your moral fault, but that's on you, not on me. Right. That's why I would include the deception condition. But I don't know. What do you think about that, Christopher?
Well, I'll let Matthieu say. I don't want to dominate. If Matthieu has something to say, I'm happy to let him speak.
Yeah. So I thought the definitions Thomas used is to lie is to speak or act against the truth in order to lead someone into error. And so this is what I would have thought that Chris, you would agree with this, but the case that Suan brought up doesn't fit into this definition because you're intending to lead the Nazi officer into error by saying there are no Jewish rats in this house. And so even though what you're telling them is technically true, you're intending to deceive them, and hence on traditional natural law theory, your action would be immoral. And this seems contrary to moral intuition to me.
But it's not contrary to truth, right? And so that would be another condition. I feel like this would be a thing where you have to have all the conditions line up in order for this thing to go through, right?
So I mean, this is where I think that distinction I made earlier between talking about when the truth is owed and what the essential malice of lying is becomes important. So there are certain cases where it's not permissible to lead people into error, even with true assertions. So, for example, in the US legal system, lawyers are, and I assume this is the case elsewhere in the West as well, in France and so forth, lawyers are said to have a duty of candor to the court. And the way that is understood is that they are obliged not just not to lie to the court, but to be forthcoming and not to mislead the court in any way. And I want to illustrate that because that's a different duty than the more general and universally applicable duty not to lie, right? So it's one thing to lie, and it's another thing to not be forthcoming, to not have candor, and the duty of candor is a special duty. It only applies to certain people at certain times in certain circumstances. The duty not to lie is a universal duty that applies to all people at all times in all circumstances. So if what you mean when you say that lying is to assert with the purpose of leading someone into error, then I don't think that lying is always wrong if that's the way you define lying. But I don't think that's the right way to define it, because I don't think that that's the way of defining it that cuts the teleological that cuts the teleology at its joints. Let's put it that way. It's not capturing what could be frustrated in the human communicative faculty.
Yeah, let me get Matthieu now in the conversation, unless, do you have anything to say about that?
No.
Yeah, well, like I also think that, we've also gone pretty long on just the lying point, but I think it's important because I think this sets up the conversation going forward on the other cases, right? And so I'm interested, Christopher, then, I mean, I know what Matthieu would do in the Nazi lying case, right? But what about Christopher? Would you go down my path, or would you do something different, or would you just expose, the Jews in your house?
I mean, yeah. So, I mean, if a Nazi were to come to my door and confront me with the direct question, "Are there any Jewish persons in your house?" I would hope to be inspired by God's grace to find some clever way to evade that question. But if at the end of the day I was unable to do that, then I would just have to. Well, I wouldn't say yes. I would never say yes. But I would remain silent, and I would do so with the understanding that the Nazi is not dumb. He will infer reasonably that there are Jews in my house from that silence, and he will, and that Jews will die because of that. But the death of 1,000 worlds before one venial sin.
Well, so you wouldn't take my solution either. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, no, I think your solution is a very good one. I'm just, the thing about your solution, Suan, is, and as I think Matthieu would point out to both of us, is that it's going to be accused of some kind of naivete about, how smart the Nazi is.
So if he keeps pressing, then that's when I'm in troubled waters.
Right, sure. And I mean, to that extent, I think letting the Nazi get to your door with Jews in the basement already represents a kind of failure, because what I think is what you really need to be doing if you're going to be in the Jew saving business in Nazi Germany, you need to decide, well, am I going to start shooting at Nazis before they can even get to my door? That's one way to go about this, right? Is to start killing some Nazis. And there'd be nothing morally wrong with that under those circumstances. That really puts an end to the Nazi at the door issue if the Nazi falls dead from a bullet wound 20 feet from your door. Or if you think that that's not workable, if you think that's imprudent, then you need to be thinking about how to get the Jews out of your basement and out of Nazi Germany, where they're actually going to be safe. It's an illusion to think that the Jews could be safe in your basement in the first place. So I think someone who is actually approaching the business of trying to save Jews in Nazi Germany just ought to be more prudent than to let the situation arise in which the Nazi is at the door and the Jews are in the basement, right? Either you want to make sure the Nazi doesn't get to the door through some form of armed resistance to the Nazi regime, or you want to make sure that when they come to the door, the Jews are not in the basement because you got them out to the UK weeks or months ago. So in that respect, I think the thought experiment already reflects a failure of, well, I don't want to be too harsh. Maybe not a failure, but not a moral failure, but not necessarily a moral failure, but some kind of failure on the part of the person who wants to save these Jews to go about it in the most prudent way, in the way that's most likely to be successful, which would involve making sure that when the Jews get to your door, there are no Nazis in the basement.
The other way around, Christopher.
And I would say to that my opinion is now more radical, and I would say that you might have the moral obligation to lie to the officer. And just as Peter Knift says, and Janet Smith too, you have to tell a big lie. So like, of course there are no Jews in my house. In fact, let me show you my Nazi flag. I hate Jews, and just try to maximize the chance that they won't go look inside. Yeah, so that's what I think is the moral duty in this condition.
I think that's somewhat naive as well, because I'm sure lots of people in Nazi Germany who were resistors at the time tried to, tell the lie in an over. There's such a thing as overselling, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Nazi who sees that you're like gung ho, you love the Nazis, you've been a Nazi since before Hitler was, blah 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 blah, is going to see through that. They're going to see through that just as much as they're going to see through potentially see through anything like the examples that Suan gives, that these clever circumlocutions of no, I don't have any Jewish rats in my house, etc., etc. If you think that saying I don't have any Jewish rats in my house is not going to get the job done, that they're going to see through that. I mean, I think they're also going to see through the person who attempts to oversell their Nazism because for very similar reasons. So, I mean, I think what's ought to be said about this is, I mean, yeah, it's a very difficult situation to be in. It requires threading. If you are going to lie, it would require, in the practical order, threading a needle that's so fine that you really don't want to find yourself in that position to begin with. Even if you think that lying is permissible, it's just a really bad situation to be in. You really want to make sure you get those you get those Jews out of the basement, or you don't let those Nazis get to the door, one or the other. It'd be interesting also, let me just add, it'd be interesting also, since this case comes up so often, to, I guess, just look at the historical documents to find out how often were Nazis accustomed to taking anybody's word for it as to whether there were Jews in somebody's house. I'm inclined to think that if Nazis suspected that there were Jews in your house enough to come knock on your door, they were almost certainly going to be searching your house no matter what you said.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's a hypothetical case, but what's a real case that happened in real life is Pope Pius XII making false baptism certificates in order to save Jews, and this was.
Where are the documents on that? I have multiple documents explicitly refuting that claim.
Well, this comes from Cardinal Roncalli, who was a really close colleague of Pope Pius XII. So it's a well-known testimony.
I'm not familiar with this. I'm not a historian, so I would just encourage people to do their own research on this. But in just looking this up very quickly, I found an article by William Doino. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but it's spelled Doino, on Public Discourse, entitled "Did Pius XII Lie to Save Jews?" That cited, and obviously when I look at stuff like that, I'm looking for the original documents. That cited the Vatican's wartime archives, Actes et Documents, volume 9, document 433, which actually involved, recorded the chiding of a certain Capuchin friar, Father Benoit, who had been falsifying ration cards to save Jews. Don't ask me how falsifying ration cards saves Jews, but that's what's recorded in the document. And a Monsignor Dell'Acqua warned Father Benoit repeatedly to be more prudent, and explicitly says that Father Benoit did not listen to his humble advice concerning these matters. And that's from the original Vatican wartime archives. And part of the worry about what Father Benoit was doing was moral in nature, according to William Doino. I just want to note that this is a controversial claim. He also notes in there that he has confirmed with the Jesuit postulators of Pius XII's cause in Rome that Pius XII never authorized the forging of any baptismal certificates or any other kind of lying to save Jews during World War II. One reason why that would be antecedently unlikely, in addition to the reasons I just gave, is because the forging of a baptismal certificate doesn't just represent a kind of lying. It's borderline sacrilegious. because you're not just lying, you're falsifying the sacramental history. I mean, and it would cause all kinds of problems down the line. You know, what do you do if after the war one of those Jews shows up in a Catholic church to be married, producing his fake baptismal certificate authorized by Pius XII? You would have or goes to be ordained, or anything like that, producing a false baptismal certificate. This has the potential to create chaos in the church.
There was a way to distinguish both. You could distinguish both. I'm sure they took this into account.
Yeah, let me just hop in really quick because I mean, so I think that the historical point is interesting. I'll let Matthieu respond because you know Christopher forwarded a claim. Matthieu, I could tell, was interested in responding, so I'll let him do that. But I think that for us in this ethical seminar, what we're more interested in is just, you know, suppose that we have a case in which a pope has to save the Jews, right? And he does it through baptismal certificates, right? So I'd like Matthieu to kind of also explain the ins and outs of how the fake baptismal certificates went about saving, you know, the Jews, or at least, you know, as it is claimed, right? But Matthieu, I want you to defend the historical point, and I want you to get into that second point about just the mechanics of how, you know, forging those baptismal certificates would save Jews.
So I haven't investigated in real depth the historical point because it came from a testimony of I believe it's Cardinal Roncalli, who was really close to Pope Pius XII, and he reported having seen this Pope make those baptism certificates. So of course there are going to be people who deny this because like Pope Pius XII is the Pope of the trads, and so they don't like it. And I think this leads to conspiracy theories denying history close to the Jesus mythicists. I mean, from the evidence I've seen, I haven't done a deep historical research on this, but maybe people can do it for themselves and make up their mind on this. What was your second question?
So it's just like, you know, leaving aside the historical point, what was just the mechanics of how forging these false certificates, forging these certificates would save lives of the Jews? Can you just explain?
Because it would. Yeah, because if it was certified they were baptized, they wouldn't be qualified as Jews, and they wouldn't be persecuted by the Nazis officers. They wouldn't. If they looked for them, they could just show their certificate, and they would leave them alone. So they would be protected.
Yeah, I mean, from what I remember, the Nazis also cared about like blood, right? So if you had Jewish ancestry.
Saint Edith Stein didn't say
what?
Saint Edith Stein was a Jew by blood, but a Catholic by faith. She was still sent to her death. So I also don't see how the baptismal certificate is going to save anybody.
Well, I don't know. I have to look deeper in this question.
Say Maximilian Kolbe, would he count as another example of that?
No, he wasn't born in a Jewish family, was he?
I'm not sure. I remember I heard someone saying something like that. Let me see.
He's Polish. He's a Polish priest, but I don't know if he comes from a Jewish mother.
Yeah, or I might be mistaken, but let me see. Yeah, maybe I'm mistaken. I think I saw like something that made me think that, but it might not have been the case. Yeah, but leaving that aside, I think Edith Stein is it's a perfectly fine example. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the other thing too is just at that point, then we'd have to question the mechanics on whether it was really necessary to do that. Let's say for this hypothetical pope, right? But at that point, then that would just, you know, Christopher and I would probably come down on the same hammer.
So you would say he sinned?
Yeah, I mean if he actually produced false baptismal certificates, then he sinned. And I just want to be clear about like what that means. I don't think that even approaches any kind of problem concerning the magisterium, because in falsifying baptismal certificates, Pius XII, let's say he did that. Let's just grant all the historical point, right? Let's say he did that. In doing so, he would not be engaged in any kind of magisterial act whatsoever, right? Baptismal certificates are not magisterial documents. And so not only would it be the case that he would not be engaged in any kind of infallible magisterial act in doing that, he would not be engaged in any kind of magisterial act at all. All we would be dealing with in that case, if in fact that were the historical fact that he had falsified or had authorized the falsification of baptismal certificates, we would just be dealing with a very, very pedestrian case of something that happens probably almost every day, called the Pope committed a sin.
Yeah, I didn't say it was of any authority whatsoever in terms of magisterial teaching. Yeah, I agree with that.
Right.
I said that in the beginning.
Yeah, well, and also if anybody's interested on, I think the reason why I accidentally thought Maximilian Kolbe was like Jewish and but Catholic was that I saw this picture online that said the Catholic Church isn't racist and blah blah blah, and it showed all these pictures of saints from different cultures, and then they showed him for like the church loves Jewish people or whatever, and I was like, okay, well, given the pattern, I thought that it would apply all the way, but obviously not. So just if anyone's interested, like, dude, what's wrong with Suan? Like, yeah, that kind of picture misled me, but now I understand like what happens. But anyway, so I think that we can move on to the next case.
Can I just ask? I just want to ask one more question that I think actually helps maybe illuminate what's going on here.
All right, so, a burning
Matthieu,
question.
Matthieu, you've made it very clear that you think sometimes lying is permissible. Let me ask this: do you think that it's sometimes permissible to commit perjury, that is, to lie under oath?
To lie under oath. Do you have a specific scenario?
Yeah, just take the Nazi at the door case again, right? Let's come back to that one. And suppose the Nazi comes to your door and he says, "Do you have any Jews in your basement?" And you say no. And the Nazi says, "Are you Christian?" And you say, "Yes." I suppose you wouldn't have any reason to lie about that, right? And he says, "Oh, okay. Well, do you swear by your God, the living God, Jesus Christ, that there are no Jews in your basement?" What do you say then?
I would just say I don't swear to anything, and I would reject it. I would say I don't swear in general. Yeah.
Because you don't believe that it's ever permissible to swear?
No, that's not what I said. I would just tell another lie saying I don't swear in general to this Nazi officer, even though I think it's permissible to swear in a court of justice.
Well, Christopher, let me hop in real quick, because I remember, Matthieu, you kind of made the point, but you want to maximize and do all that you can to save the Jews in your basement, right? So, I mean, why not just lie again? Because that would maybe maximize the odds.
Yeah, the intention has to be to maximize the odds that the Nazi officers won't go look in your attic or in your basement. And then you can try to find your own method, as long as you think it has the most chances to maximize the fact they won't go look. So whatever you want to say.
But like, wouldn't swearing by Jesus Christ just kind of be the final nail in the coffin?
Yeah, except for doing that.
What'd you say?
Do whatever you can do to maximize, except with that.
Right. So then my question is, so then, Matthieu, you do think then that it's never permissible to commit perjury? Is that right?
To swear to God on a particular subject?
Falsely.
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's
right. So why is all perjury impermissible, but some lying is permissible? What makes the difference?
Because the perjury is perjury has God inside, so I mean it's almost sacrilegious if you do that.
Yeah, sure, but that kind of begs the question. It's sacrilegious if the lie is wrong, right? It's sacrilegious to do wrong things to God, such as to tell a lie. But your view is that lying is not always wrong, right? So if lying is not always wrong, why would it be impermissible to tell God a lie that it's permissible to tell some human being?
I think lying, as I said, is always a metaphysical evil, but not always a moral evil. And in this case, I would say that you shouldn't. I mean, my moral intuition tells me you shouldn't tell any falsehood using God's name. I mean, this is just too much. I don't know how you
my moral intuition. Sorry, my
Yeah.
moral intuition tells me that too. But I infer from that moral intuition that all lying is wrong.
Yeah, and then I would say that it's different just to tell a falsehood when you're not talking about God and it's just daily issues, because there's not the sacrilegious dimension to it.
I mean, the other thing I'd add in too. Sorry, Christopher, but the other thing I'd add in too is that I'm not sure if, like, you know, when you say at that moment you swear to God, right, that's anything really unique, because I feel like, you know, every moment of my existence, if I'm being a devout Catholic, should be swearing to God my loyalty and allegiance to him, right? So if I just make it explicit, then that's just me already revealing what ought to be there, right? So I don't think this is a unique case, so to speak, of swearing, because my whole life and existence should be swearing to God. That should be the proper origin of all good action.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. That your whole every time you speak, you're swearing to God.
Because I would swear to God that there are no Jewish rats in my basement. You know, like I would swear that to him without a problem.
I mean, I agree with Matthieu here. Actually, I don't think we should think we're always swearing to God, because there is a purpose to swearing, and I mean, yeah. So it's the problem, though. I think with your response, Matthieu, is just that we say it introduces this sacrilegious dimension to it, and I agree that it, in a way, it does. But the thing is, the only way to explain why it would be sacrilegious is to say because it's lying. But the lying to God should only be sacrilegious if the lie being told is an impermissible lie, right? So it's sacrilegious to do things to God that are generally impermissible. But if you're right that sometimes lying is permissible, especially a lie to save a life, right? I'm sure God wants them Jews not to get murdered, right? Why would he mind you telling that lie, even in his own name? If indeed it's permissible to tell a lie like that in general, and if indeed you're doing it for a purpose that God endorses, why would God be offended by your telling that lie in an oath under his name?
Yeah, you're making a good point. I have to think about this one.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on and say a few other things, but I think that we should move on. So, yeah, Matthieu, can you go on to the other cases now?
Yeah, so another case I want to bring up is, for example, torture. Torture is a clear case where I think it's sometimes permissible to, that the end might justify the mean. So the bad mean is torture in this case. And so suppose like a terrorist hit a bomb in New York about to explode in 2 hours, and you don't know where the location of the bomb is, and you have this terrorist right in front of you. So I would think it's permissible to torture him in order for him to tell everyone where the bomb is to save the whole city. That's clearly permissible, and I think I have the Catholic tradition with me on this one, because the Church authorized torture in history in some particular cases, even though some recent statements by Benedict XVI that Chris made me aware of are more reluctant to the moral permissibility of torture. But yeah, the terrorist example is a clear case where I see from moral intuition that it's permissible to torture, and that in this case the end might justify the mean.
Yeah, let me just start first, and then I'll let Christopher hop on, since Christopher went first last time. Yeah, I mean, so I'm just gonna be honest and lay my cards on the table that I haven't really thought through a lot on this particular subject, right? Because on one hand, like I could see like, maybe there are certain kinds of torture that are impermissible by nature. Maybe there are other kinds that aren't, right? And so I don't have a set opinion on this, and so I'm willing to hear out both sides on this. But let me see here. I mean, has the traditional Thomist position been that torture is impermissible, or under all circumstances, or what's the idea? Like, what's the purport? Like, has anyone claimed that? What's the argument here? To Matthieu,
Chris,
or maybe to Christopher? Yeah.
Well, Chris can represent the Thomist tradition adequately, so.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So this is a little bit harder than the lying case, because the church has not spoken anywhere nearly as definitively to torture as she has to lying. And not only that, but it's also just there's a great deal more fuzziness even about what torture is, let alone what our moral judgment about it ought to be. So historically, there's been there's been a great deal more moral latitude in the church's magisterium about the permissibility of torture. Not because the church believed that sometimes the ends justify the means, but because simply the church seemed to believe at that time that torture was not an intrinsically evil means to elicit a confession or what have you. As the natural law tradition developed, people started developing arguments against it. And in the 20th century, especially with the weight of secular opinion so strongly against torture, this has become something that the magisterium has condemned to some extent. So there's an allocution from 2007. I think this is 2007. Let me double check. Yeah, by Benedict XVI to prison guards, if I'm remembering correctly, where he cites the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, paragraph 404, in which he says, in this regard, I reiterate that the prohibition against torture, quote, cannot be contravened under any circumstances, end quote. Now, I don't think that really even comes close to representing any definitive judgment about torture on the part of the magisterium. So I don't think it's been settled by either the extraordinary or the ordinary and universal magisterium that lying is intrinsically evil. But there does seem to be, at least now, some kind of magisterial intervention by Benedict XVI to condemn it as intrinsically evil, although it's a matter of theological dispute as to how much weight that ought to be assigned and so on. And at any rate, in order to give a real clear natural law analysis of the moral permissibility and or intrinsic evil of torture, we'd have to be clear about what torture is.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a definition of torture if you want. Mm-hmm. Torture is the deliberate, systematic, or wanton infliction of physical or mental suffering by one or more persons in an attempt to force another person to yield information or to make a confession or for any other reason.
Yeah, that's really good. So I think under this is just my own opinion. Under that definition, I think it probably is intrinsically evil because of the part to force the person to yield, to give information. Because in that sense, I think torture represents a kind of something parallel to intoxication, by which a man is deprived of his reason or the freedom of his will. And so it would fall under condemnation under natural law theory for much this same reason as serious intoxication is condemned by natural law theory. It's the kind of thing that deprives man of reason. And that's kind of the goal, right? If you're a torturer, what you want to have happen is for the pain to outweigh the pain to be so excessive that the person is no longer able to reason about whether he ought to reveal this information to you or not anymore, and therefore to just give it up in an attempt to get you to stop inflicting the pain.
I'd actually, Christopher, I might actually disagree here with you on that point. Well, the reason why is because, and see, this is why, I guess I'm the nice middle ground sometimes for both sides, but the reason why I disagree is because, the person who's being tortured, they can reason, so to speak, to reveal the truth or reveal some kind of information, because they might say, man, I have two options in front of me. I can keep on getting tortured and remain silent, or I could, end the pain and just give the truth. And it seems like you could reason, okay, now I got to do this. I have to do this option, right?
So if it weren't for the lying that would be involved, I don't think there would be any problem with threatening a man with torture for that reason, right?
Yeah.
So like it wouldn't involve any intentional attempts to deprive him of his reason. But the issue, and right, and I'm not suggesting that you would always succeed, right? Maybe someone is just really well trained to deal with torture, and maybe he wouldn't be deprived of his reason, but he still might reason in the way that you've suggested,
sure,
such that he decides to give up the information for on the kind of rational grounds that you've set forth. But when you look at what torturers are all often, if not always, attempting to do, is they're attempting to get around the person's reason altogether. They want to break them down so much that when they finally turn over that information, they're not doing so in the way that you've suggested, right? They might be doing it, they might be thinking that way in the beginning, and they might, for that reason, in the very beginning, decide to just give up the information. But what I'm talking about, like the kind of thing that's happening over the course of hours or days or even weeks of torture, where the goal is to break the down down so thoroughly that they are no longer even capable of engaging in reasoning about whether they ought to give the information up or not anymore. They've been reduced to the status of a brute animal who will do anything to just make the pain stop. Right? I mean, they wouldn't just give up the information. This is illustrated by the fact that if you torture someone enough, they won't just be willing to give up the information that you're after. You could get someone to the point that they'd be willing to do anything. They'd be willing to kill their own parents, whatever, because they have been reduced to the status of a brute animal that it's completely without reason. They'd be willing to do anything to make the pain stop.
Yeah.
And that's what I think, doing that or intending to do that is, I think that's intrinsically evil.
Yeah. Like when real quick, when Christopher puts it like that, like if we're talking about, almost like a basic, like a lobotomy on somebody, right? Then I would agree, like, okay, yeah, that's impermissible. But Matthieu, you were going to say something?
Yeah, you don't have to go this far. You don't have to break the person up till the point where he or she loses reason. I mean, you can just intend the minimum of torture in order to make them crack and tell you where the bomb is hidden in New York. You're not intending to break this person. You're intending to get the information out of her and do the minimum of torture that's necessary in order to get this information out. And for me, it's clearly self-evident that to save a million of innocent people in a city, you can torture a guy who hit a bomb and who is gravely morally responsible for his act. I mean, this is I don't even see how this can be rationally denied. I mean, this is self-evident.
If that's what you mean by torture, then I want to say two things about that. One is that I don't think that's what Benedict XVI is condemning in his 2007 allocution. I think what he's condemning is what I'm talking about, because otherwise we'd have to say, right, that anything done to try to compel someone to cooperate with legal authority is a kind of torture. Even, for example, just holding someone in contempt of court and imprisoning him until he testifies about what he knows would be a kind of torture, because it's doing something that is in some way painful to him, even if it's just depriving him of his freedom in order to gain information. And I don't think that could possibly be what Benedict intends to condemn in the 2007 allocution. So in that case, I would say that's permissible, yeah, because it's not the kind of torture that Benedict is condemning, and it's not the kind of torture that's actually prohibited or condemned as intrinsically evil by natural law theory. But at the same time, this is the second thing I would say about it, although I would say that, yeah, that something along those lines might be permissible. It's not because the ends have justified the means. It's just because that's a permissible means.
But do you agree it's a bad mean, that you're doing something bad, like inflicting physical or mental suffering? That is bad in itself, ontologically speaking.
No, I mean that's what we do to every kind of prisoner. That's what punishment is. It can't possibly be that can't possibly be intrinsically evil. It's punishment.
Yeah, or like for instance, if you take a child's favorite toy away for a certain amount of time until they cooperate,
Right. If you want to call that torturing the child, then yeah, some torture is permissible.
No. I gave a precise and rigorous definition of what it means to torture: the deliberate, systematic, or wanton infliction of physical or mental suffering by one or more persons in order to force another person to yield information.
Yeah, but you didn't specify how serious the suffering is. So when I take a child's toy away, that is the infliction of physical or rather, that is the infliction of psychological suffering on the child to compel the child to comply with my instructions. So what you would have to add to what your definition is something about the degree or intensity of the suffering inflicted.
Okay, so suppose whipping. Can you whip the terrorist?
I think you probably can whip the terrorist, yeah.
Okay, why? Isn't whipping evil in itself?
No, I mean, no. Why would it be? If someone, I don't know, just to say, just for the sake of argument, someone beats a man nearly to death. Let's say he doesn't quite kill him, but he beats him nearly to death. Would it be impermissible to have that man whipped? Show me one philosopher or theologian prior to the 20th century or anywhere in the Catholic tradition who has ever said that would be an impermissible way of punishing that man. There's no reason to think that at all.
I think it's permissible, but not for the same reasons as you. So yeah.
I think inflicting harm on someone, you could say that like there's something ontologically bad in terms of the evil suffered of the person, right? Like they are experiencing pain, they are experiencing the privation of, let's say, their normal function in their body, right? Of just like, general health. Okay. But then like it wouldn't be ontologically disordered though, in the strict sense that we talked about with like perverting faculties, right?
Yeah, intrinsically disordered.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say
Yeah, so that's an important distinction. So, right, I mean, we not every choice which brings about some kind of metaphysical or ontological evil involves moral evil, right? So, moral evil would be ontological evil in the will. There's some kind of disorder in the will, but there's no disorder in the will just because the will chooses to bring about some kind of ontological evil in some other creature, right? If I choose to cut down the tree in my yard because I don't want it blowing over in the storm and crashing through my roof, I have brought about an ontological evil, the death of the tree. But there's no moral evil involved in that because there's nothing disordered in my will, so long as I intend to bring about that evil for the sake of some good, like the preservation of my sufficient good like the preservation of my house. Likewise, yeah, I mean, there's a certain sense in which inflicting pain on another man is an ontological evil, but there's no moral evil involved, no evil in the will, so long as I'm doing it for in a just way for a sufficient reason, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, like I mean, even cases of self-defense, let's say, where you're having to defend your body with proportionate means of defense, right?
Right.
To the extent that if it's necessary to kill the person, then it's necessary, right, to preserve one's life. But also, and the person merits death, so to speak. But also, even in the case of, for instance, as you mentioned, Matthieu, like the terrorist who's going to blow up a bomb in 2 hours. I mean, I think that would also be a kind of, let's say, social self-defense through the magistrates, through the officers of the law, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I don't think you'd even really need to make it all that complicated.
Sure.
I think all you have to say is police officers are empowered on the part of the state to summarily punish a criminal who refuses to cooperate under those kind of circumstances, right? Until he complies. And I think that's something we've always countenanced as permissible, as not intrinsically evil, as not any kind of evil means or anything like that. It's just, the punishment of criminals. There's nothing unusual about that.
Yeah, let's Matthieu. Yeah.
Don't you think it's weird to say that torture is not an evil mean, and saying that lying is an evil mean? Don't you think there's like sort of not a contradiction, but something weird going on there?
The reason I think that lying is always an evil means is because lying constitutes a frustration of a natural faculty in me. What natural faculty is being frustrated in the kinds of quote unquote torture cases that we've been talking about?
Well, the natural faculties of the body is being able to operate in its natural way. If you're beating someone, you're harming him, his natural faculties.
Right. So that just comes back to that's not a problem specifically about torture. I mean, that if that's a problem about punishment in general. Like, why would it ever be permissible for us to imprison someone or corporeally punish someone who has committed some kind of crime when that punishment involves some kind of frustration of that person's faculties? So, and the answer, right, given there, at least in the death penalty case by Aquinas, but you could apply this to any kind of punishment, right, is that given that person is a part of a greater whole of society, we are permitted to do some kind of damage to that individual for the sake of the health of the whole, for the sake of the health of the society, whether that damage takes the form of imprisonment, corporal punishment, or even death. It's for the sake of that of that greater whole. In the same way that it would be a kind of privation to me to have to cut off my arm, but if my arm is cancerous, we're going to do it anyway, because the good of my arm is subordinated to the greater good of my whole body.
Yeah, the principle of totality.
Right.
Yeah.
So that would justify punishment, right? In all its varieties. That's not to say every kind of punishment is permissible, but it would justify.
So up to what degree do you think punishment is permissible?
Right. So that comes back to what I had mentioned earlier. I think there is a kind of torture, something that goes by the name of torture, that would be impermissible, that would constitute an intrinsically evil frustration of another's faculties without sufficient reason, in a way that wouldn't be justified by the principle of totality. If we were to take the physical pain or psychological pain to the point that person would be totally deprived of reason. Because I don't think that's the kind of thing that could ever, right? I mean, if that's what you think needs to be done to a man in order to punish him, then what you really need to be asking yourself the question of, well, maybe he needs to just be put to death. But there's certain things you can't do that kind of a thing to a man for the same reason like that you can't rape a rapist in punishment and so on and so forth.
Torture is not punishment in itself, because punishment comes after the crime. Torture is the only goal of torture is to get out information of the person. It's not to punish the person.
This is not after the crime. The terrorist who has planted a bomb has committed a crime. That's a crime, right? You can't go around planting bombs.
That's not the goal of torture. That's not the goal of torture. The goal of torture is to prevent the evil that's going to come next, the bomb exploding. And so you're not torturing the guy to punish him. You're torturing him to get information from him.
Well, what you're torturing him for is to get him to stop committing the crime that he's committing right now, which is the crime of obstructing justice, the crime of preventing the police from finding and defusing the bomb. That is also a crime. It's a crime in addition to the original planting. So there's the original planting of the bomb, that's a crime. And then there's the obstruction of justice, the obstruction of the officers in their efforts to secure the public safety. And sometimes punishment is not just retribution, it's also for the purpose of deterrence. And sometimes the deterrence in question is not just deterrence of others, it may be deterrence of the very person being punished to get him to stop what he's doing right now.
Yeah, so I mean, Christopher, you would say that then torture is a species of punishment, right?
The permissible kind of torture that would involve things that don't go to the extreme of depriving a man utterly of reason. Yes.
Yeah, Matthieu, let me let you have like the last word here, and then I think we should move on to the third case. But yeah, keep on going, Matthieu. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but I think that so suppose you got a terrorist that has committed a crime and it's over now, he's in prison. I don't think you can give the same degree of torture to him who's now inoffensive compared to the guy that is going to explode the bomb and who has yet to give you the information. I think the degree of torture, it would be wrong to torture a prisoner that is not a threat to the common good anymore as a punishment, whereas I don't think it would be wrong to torture someone who's directly threatening the common good. So yeah, in this sense, I don't think you can compare the two cases. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with everything except that last sentence, that the two cases can't be compared. So I agree that once the crime is over, you have less reason to inflict pain as punishment on this person. You don't have
you shouldn't ever torture.
You have reason. Retribution.
Yes, someone.
Hold on, let Matthieu talk. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if someone committed a crime, so like he murdered people and he's now going to go to jail, or suppose he gets death penalty. I don't think death penalty should be painful. It should be done if it's permissible. It should be done in the less painful way possible, because there's no point in inflicting gratuitous pain after the crime has been committed. Whereas the purpose of the pain in torture is to extract the information.
Yeah, so I deny that it would be gratuitous. I mean, I don't, like, historically, we've never thought that you can't inflict pain as a kind of punishment, that the only way to punish someone is by either confining him in a cell or putting him painlessly to death. Historically, that has not been, neither of those has been a popular form of punishment, mostly because it just hasn't been possible to do that kind of a thing, right? Ordinarily, you would prefer some kind, if you're the state, you would prefer some kind of quick but painful punishment that's going to punish crime in an effective way that doesn't require you to house inmates and take on all that kind of expense and hardship as the state. So you're gonna beat people. You might cut off the hands of thieves. If you are going to execute people, you're not going to go out of your way to make it painless. And none of this was thought to be gratuitous. I mean, to say that it's gratuitous would be to suggest that there's no reason for it, but there is a reason for it. Retribution against the criminal for the crime that he has committed. There's no requirement that retributive punishment only take the form of physical confinement or painless death. You can beat someone as a form of punishment. Nobody has ever said otherwise, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, well, I don't think you should beat prisoners. Like once they're in prison, you shouldn't beat them like they do in Guantanamo or things like that. I mean,
well, yeah, when you say like they do in Guantanamo, we're now back in
yeah,
the
okay,
realm.
or even any other prison that doesn't go as far as Guantanamo. I don't think you should just beat prisoners like that.
So, I mean, maybe not. I mean, maybe you should choose between beating them or imprisoning them. But for like the example I gave before, let's say for whatever reason, the state does not have the capacity to imprison people. Let's just say that happens, and it's certainly possible. And let's just say you have someone who's committed a serious crime, but not a crime worthy of death. And so, and you're thinking, how am I going to punish this person? Well, you might have them whipped. You might put them in the stocks. You might do any number of things that would be embarrassing or physically painful, but that don't involve any kind of imprisonment or anything like that. And I mean, and then like if that's permissible, and nobody in the tradition has ever argued that it's not, then I don't know why you couldn't also do something like that to a prisoner. So, for example, if someone, for example, drives drunk and kills somebody, kills a whole family of 4 because he was driving drunk, that man has done something utterly contemptible and deserves serious punishment. But you could imagine the judge saying to the prisoner, well, look, I have 2 options in front of me. I could put you in prison for 20 years and you won't get beat at all during that 20 years. Or I could have you in prison for 5 years, but once a week, you're going to be whipped for your crime. I mean, what's wrong with the second option? I don't understand what's wrong with that second option.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems sadistic, to put it like that. I don't think it's Christ-like. I don't think Christ would whip people.
Yeah, we might. I'll agree with you that we might have worries about doing that kind of thing because we'd be worried about the kind of psychological damage it might do to the people who are responsible for doing the beating or whipping. That's a very valid worry. All I'm pointing out, though, is that there's no worry there about doing some kind of injustice to the person who's being punished in that way. And there's nothing to suggest in the Thomistic tradition, in the Catholic tradition, or in the natural law tradition that corporal punishment is not Christ-like or impermissible.
Yeah, just to kind of round this conversation off, then we can move to maybe the other cases now. But we originally began with the case of the terrorist, right? And so I think I'm in agreement with Christopher that it would be a species of punishment to not only get the information out of him, but also he kind of deserves to be punished for what he's done. The crime has been committed, but it's still ongoing too because of the obstruction of justice. Now, in the case of let's say someone who's in prison, right, and the crime's already done, can we keep beating them? I mean, I think Christopher and I might differ on this point, but like, for instance, let's say that Ted Bundy has already killed all the women that he's going to kill, and they're torturing him to find where the bodies are. I mean, I think that would be permissible. because in a sense, like justice still hasn't been done for the families who have a right to the bodies of their loved ones and so on and so forth, and a right to an honorable burial. So I think that, you could torture Ted Bundy, even though he's in prison, and probably, let's say this isn't one of the times he broke out, I think you could still do that. Of course, the degree is the question. But I would agree with Christopher, right, that you can't make him, basically just a vegetable.
Sure.
Okay, let's go maybe to the next case now.
Yeah. So the next.
Sorry, let me just add one more thing to that, which I just want to qualify further. I would have a problem with any kind of torture that involves permanent mutilation in a significant way. So I do actually worry about the cutting off of the hands kind of case and stuff like that. But the cases where you're just inflicting some physical pain in a way that doesn't involve permanent mutilation, I don't see any reason to worry about that.
Yeah, like Chinese water torture, or just putting Baby Shark on loop or something like that.
Right.
Okay, yeah, Matthew, what's the next case?
Yeah, so
because I think these, from what I remember, these two cases I think are actually the most interesting. I think it's the suicide and contraception, right?
Yeah, the suicide contraception. Yeah. So suicide, I have a case. So it's very linked to American history. So it's 9/11. The towers are burning, and you're up there, and you're going to burn to death if you stay in the towers. Is it permissible to jump and to commit suicide? And I would argue that yes, of course, you're not sinning in doing that. And so here's a case where I think it would be permissible to end one's life.
Mm-hmm. And I know you have a variation of this case too.
Yeah, but I want to see how Chris responds to
you'll
that.
You'll save that, because that's
absolutely.
A good one. I like that one. But sounds demented to say I like that case, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah. So Christopher, you start this time since I started last time.
Yeah, I guess I would just I have a simple reply to that. I mean, I don't think that's suicide. It's probably not suicide. And the reason why I think it's probably not suicide is because if the person who jumps out of the towers and if he just magically lands on a trampoline or whatever that the firefighters have set out at the base of the building for himself and survives, he will not consider his having jumped out of the building to be a failure, right? He got what he wanted. He got out of the fire. He got out of the scorching heat. So in a way that shows, well, he doesn't intend death. He's not attempting to kill himself. And so I think this would A, not be a case of suicide in all likelihood, and B, would thereby be justifiable by an application of the principle of double effect. He foresees that he will most likely die, but he does not intend it. And what he does intend is good. And the good effect follows at least as immediately as the evil effect. And he doesn't intend any evil. And it's a proportional way of trying to achieve the good that he's attempting to achieve. Arguably, I think that's maybe where the arguableness of it comes in. But that's my impression.
So that's the typical Thomistic response of it's not suicide and using double effect, etc. And this is where I made the case more interesting, is that I just slightly modify it. And I say that you're up there in the towers burning, and you're in a closed room. There's no windows, and you're going to burn to death. And there's a gun on the table right next to you. Is it permissible to shoot yourself in the head? You can't use double effect here because you're directly intending your death. So this won't work. The Thomistic answer won't work. But it would be weird using moral intuition to say that in one case it's permissible to die by jumping, and in the other case it's not permissible to want to avoid burning to death by shooting yourself in the head. This is weird. I mean,
I think it would be. I think that would be wrong. I think that would be gravely sinful. Although I think that would obviously constitute exactly the kind of situation in which we would say, although it's gravely sinful, it's probably not mortally sinful because that person is under extreme duress, profound duress of exactly the sort that would prevent a grave sin from being mortal. But with that said, I think, yeah, no, it's wrong and you shouldn't do it. Here's why I think it's actually pretty easily distinguishable from the jumping case, is that in the jumping case, the death, dying is not my means of escaping from the fire. My means of escaping from the fire is jumping out the window, right? So think about the person who has jumped and is halfway down the building now. That person already has what he wants, right? He's still alive. In fact, he's in perfect health for the time being. He's about to die, but for the time being, he's in perfect health and he has what he wanted, namely to be out of the fire. Now, think instead, come to your case, your adaptation of the case, where instead he can't jump out, but he has a gun, he has a pistol at his disposal, and he decides, I'm going to shoot myself in the head. Well, in that case, his death is the means. His death is the means of escaping from the fire, right? The way he's reasoning in that case is, if I'm dead, I can't feel the fire, right? I can't be burned up if I'm dead, what will be burned up will not be me; it'll be my corpse. And in that case, he's clearly using his death as a means to escape the fire, whereas the person who's jumping out the window is not using his death as a means to escaping the fire. And you can tell that because he gets out of the fire before he even dies. So the death can't be a means to the escaping of the fire in the jumping case. In the pistol case, his death clearly is a means, because you could kind of think like, well, you could ask him, you could interrogate him, you'd be like, what if you shoot yourself in the head and you survive? You're just badly wounded, and the fire is now continuing to advance and it's going to burn you up. What would you think about that? He's going to say, that's horrible. That's the exact opposite of what I wanted to happen, right? I wanted to be dead. And so I think that clearly shows he's using his death as a means to escape the fire in a way that the person jumping out the window is not.
Sure, but what if he's intending not to suffer? He's not intending to die. He's intending not to suffer. If he could survive without suffering and die from the fire, he would accept it. But he just wants to escape the suffering.
Right. So then that gets into like what I will concede is hard questions about how we analyze people's subjective intentions. But I think the problem that case runs into is I don't think anybody could seriously believe that shooting himself in the head was a kind of pain reliever or something that's just going to help him escape pain. People universally understand that to take a pistol to your head and pull the trigger is to kill yourself. And if we give up that kind of principle, right, then we have to we start finding ourselves in very weird situations where we have to admit, for example, like if I take the pistol and shoot somebody in the chest, I could say, well, I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to see what the blood looked like on his shirt. Right. And so there's an extent to which one cannot help having certain intentions insofar as one sees that a certain thing will follow immediately and necessarily from what one does, or if not necessarily, at least it follows so often that if you do it, you can't help but intend what comes after.
What if you inject a liquid that has poison in it and that also has a pain reliever in the same liquid? So the guy is intending not to be in pain with the fire, even though he foresees that a secondary consequence of this will be his death.
Yeah, that's a harder case. I mean, so that case reminds me of a case that we face often in the real world, which is like how much narcotics to give to people who have terminal disease, who are in their final days or even hours, because we know that those narcotics could accelerate their death, but at the same time they keep them out of pain. So it's actually very similar to a real world case that physicians often face. Um, uh, it, in that case, I think it would depend on how quickly acting the poison was. So remember, for the principle of double effect to apply, it has to be the case not only that the action in question is not intrinsically evil, and that the agent has no evil intention, and that the means is proportional to the good effect, but also that the good effect follows at least as immediately as the bad effect. So in that case, it might depend on how quickly acting the poison is. If I reasonably foresee that if I inject this poisoned pain reliever, that it will relieve my pain immediately, but it won't kill me for 2 hours. And I know that the fire is going to consume me in the next 15 minutes. Yeah, I think that could be permissible. Yeah.
What if the poison kills in 5 minutes?
If the poison kills me before the fire does, then the bad effect follows more immediately than the good effect. Or at least I should say, if the poison kills me before the fire reaches me, the good effect, the bad effect follows more immediately than the good effect. In which case, I think we're back in the territory of the person who understands how the injection works could not help but understand that it will cause his death, and that the death, and rather than the pain relieving function of the medicine, will be what prevents him from feeling pain, and he will therefore inevitably intend his death as a means to escaping the pain.
So if you were in this situation, you would just accept to burn to death in a horrible way?
That's an entirely different question, going to how good of a person I am. And I'm good at thinking. I'm not always very good at doing. But, look, I mean, whether I would personally follow through with my convictions in a time of great duress has no effect on whether I'm right or wrong about those convictions, of course, right? So suppose I didn't. Suppose I succumbed to the temptation to do that. I mean, that's no mark against my theory. It just means that I'm like everybody else. I'm a sinful man. I can be tempted beyond my strength, to the point where I would succumb and do something I know to be wrong. But that's also where I think it becomes important to realize the way in which a very painful, very panic-inducing situation like that would seriously reduce my culpability for doing that under those circumstances. So I don't mean to say here that somebody who in that circumstance who did such a thing would be guilty of mortal sin. I don't mean to say that at all.
Yeah. I mean, I'd also add in too that this might be interesting, but like if I was in the, like, for instance, versus the gun versus like the injection, right? So it has, the injection could, like, it is a painkiller, but it could be to the point of death, right? Or maybe it is guaranteed to be to the point of death, right? Something like that.
And, yeah, and I mean, to that extent, it's worth bearing in mind that we do things that shorten our lives all the time for good reasons. There's all kinds of things that we do for a variety of reasons that shorten our lives. And so we are dealing here with something that is a question of degree in a certain way. One of the reasons why I said that the injection case would be okay if the poison acted more slowly than the fire did, is because we often make, in the real world, we often make judgments like that, right? That, for example, if I have stage 4 terminal cancer and I have 3 months to live, I'm not going to spend much time worrying about getting fat or eating unhealthy food, unhealthful food, because I know, right, that the cancer is going to get me before the heart attack does, right? So I just don't worry about those things anymore. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean,
what if the poison kills you 5 minutes earlier than the fire?
Right. In that case, I do think we have a problem with the principle of double effect, insofar as the bad effect is following more immediately than the good effect. Yeah, I mean, right. That's part of why we have that's one of the requirements for the application of the principle of double effect. It's to rule out precisely cases like that where. Because otherwise, right, then you could get into games like, who knows what good effects this might have 10 years from now or 1,000 years from now. And that justifies me doing this thing that's going to have evil effects today, right? Well, obviously we don't, that would be a kind of moral insanity to endorse that kind of thing. And so we have good reason for insisting that the good effect has to follow at least as immediately from the action as the bad effect. And I think having that requirement makes a lot of sense, because it does so much good work. It distinguishes between the two cases you've presented, right? The jumping case, where we are drawn to wanting to say that's permissible, and the pistol case, where I think we do see, I think at some level we all do recognize that there's something wrong about that. For example, just to try to illustrate the way in which we see that there's something wrong with that. If I were one of the firefighters who recovered that person's body from the rubble on 9/11, and upon examining the body, I realized that this person had a massive bullet wound in the side of his head, I would be able to reasonably infer that he probably took his own life in order to escape the fire. But I'm probably going to do my best to conceal that fact from the family when I had the conversation with them about how I just found their loved one, the corpse of their loved one, in the rubble at 9/11, because we naturally see there's something shameful about that. Even if we think it's excusable, even if we think, okay, there's limited culpability because of the great duress involved and everything, and so on and so forth, it's the kind of thing that we're going to be inclined to want to conceal from others, because we sense shamefulness in it. And the reason we sense the shamefulness in it is because at some level we all understand that's wrong. That what that person did was morally wrong.
All right. Well, I would maybe contribute to the conversation at this point, but I think for the sake of time, we should just move on to the next topic. So, Matthieu, do you have anything else to say, or do you want to move on?
Yeah, on this 9/11 thing, I just had one last example. It's the general principle. It's never permissible to directly and voluntarily kill innocent human beings. this is a premise used in abortion. There is this thing where there was this question during the 9/11 attacks, where was it permissible to shoot down the plane before it was going to hit the towers? And yes, some people say that, well, you're not directly intending the death of the people in the plane. You're just shooting at the plane, not at the people in the plane. And that's how they try to get out of this. But then suppose that the people are coming in a balloon where they have a bomb attached to them, and that in order to make the bomb explode, you have to shoot them directly. It would be weird to say that you can't do that.
I agree. Yeah. I agree. It would be weird to say you can't do that. It's a straightforward case of self-defense. So, I mean, when we talk about self-defense, there's no requirement for self-defense that the person in question be formally culpable for the threat that they pose. So you can imagine, for example, if someone breaks into my house at night and I pull my rifle out and I go to shoot them, and I later find out after shooting him, and he sadly dies. If I later find out that he was crazy and had no idea what he was doing, that doesn't change the moral analysis in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I'm entitled under the principles of self-defense to use lethal force against anybody who poses me a threat, whether they do so culpably or inculpably. It doesn't make a difference. So when, for example, in the 9/11 case, would it be permissible to shoot down the jet? Yeah, I mean, it's a straightforward case of defense of third parties.
No, because the people in the plane, the passengers, are innocent, and they're not doing They're not doing something that's threatening your life. They're innocent. They're just like being transported.
Well, right, yeah. So I mean, they would be unintentional collateral damage in shooting down the plane, because the target in that case would be the terrorists who are piloting the plane, and the passengers in that case would then just be collateral damage, permissible collateral damage, because we foresee that by shooting the plane down, we're going to save a great deal of people, and that B, the passengers are going to die anyway, right? The passengers are dead either way. If we know what, if they're going to fly the plane into the building, these passengers are dead either way. And so that all comes into our analysis. And of course, right, that neither the church nor the natural law tradition has ever suggested that you can't have collateral damage in self-defense or in war, for that matter. The principles are very similar. And then
I agree with you on that. I agree with you on the case. It was just like another interesting thing to bring up, the double effect. So we agree on this one. So the one last things, one of the last cases I wanted to present was contraception. So what I'm going to say here comes from Jimmy Akin himself, who it's in his book Teaching with Authority, page 190 to 194, for those who want to check it out. And so Akin's position is that the magisterium has condemned contraception in all cases concerning the conjugal intercourse, and not in all sexual intercourse for humanae vitae. The Catechism deals with contraception only in the section against the fecundity of marriage. And theologians have discussed the possibility of using contraception in the cases of rape. And for example, there was a case in the 1960s or 70s where a group of nuns who were living in Congo, and they were going through neighborhoods that were very dangerous. There were a lot of rapes going out there. And so the nuns didn't want to get pregnant. And so they took pills in order to prevent conception if they got raped. So it's not an abortion, and it's just an act of contraception in self-defense, as you could say. And so many theologians argue that this was permissible because they didn't want to misuse their sexual faculties. They wanted just to protect themselves from getting pregnant, and so it was a rare example where contraception was morally permissible.
Yeah, well, Christopher went first last time, so I guess I'll go first this time. Yeah, and so with this case, like my intuition has been that it was still wrong to contracept. At least that's my like first impression. I think I could be swayed either way. It just really depends on how you do it, you know, like because one of the things that I'm concerned about is that, like, okay, so we're not if I recall properly, like not every contraceptive is an abortifacient, right? So sometimes some contraceptives, like they'll do it after the fact, like make it impossible for the egg to plant on the uterine wall properly or something like that. Other times, you know, it'll make the egg not receive any sperm in the first place or something like that, if I remember how all this works. So I mean, I feel like that would be something at least peripherally relevant to some extent, but then the whole bottom line is that it is treating pregnancy, you know, as a burden. I mean, to some extent, you know, pregnancy can be conceived of as a burden, even the creation of a life of a child, right? And you know, the act of rape in and of itself is, I would say, it's not open to life insofar as it is not considering, you know, the fact that if you do create an offspring, you know, you have to also incur responsibilities for that. So there's not the unity aspect that's necessary for properly ordered sexual activity to some extent, even though it might have maybe the natural integrity, so to speak, of the sex act. But I mean, those are just some of the thoughts running through my head, but I know that Christopher might be able to more precisely kind of lay some things out. But honestly, at this point, like I have this intuition, but I'm not comfortable just saying, hey, I have this intuition, and that's the end of the conversation. So, I mean, I could be swayed. I don't know. But like, I'm ready to hear out what both sides have to say.
So I guess I disagree with Suan then, because I think it is permissible. And the reason I think it's permissible is because it's not contraception. So we have to distinguish when we use the word contraception between the pill, the medication that we use to contracept, which gets called contraception, right? Like I can hold up a pill and say, this is contraception, right? It would be a form of Gnosticism to think that's evil, right? Because that's not an action, that's a thing, right? And there are a whole variety of reasons why someone might take a pill that has a contraceptive effect. I'm sure there's all kinds of medications that decrease fertility in a variety of ways that women would have a good reason to take for the treatment of some serious disease. And in fact, right, I mean, we even permit complete sterilization of a person if there's some good reason for it. If a woman, for example, has uterine cancer, we permit that a whole hysterectomy that we know will sterilize that woman for the rest of her life. So, right, I mean, we that's the first thing to note, right? That we don't consider every action which has as its effect a decrease or the elimination of fertility as contraception in the sense that it's condemned in Humanae Vitae. Okay, so the other way of talking about contraception is as a species of moral action. And when we talk about contraception as a species of moral action, then we can see that what the nuns who are taking contraceptive pills in case they are unfortunately raped are doing is not contraception in the case of, so they're taking contraception, but the kind of action that they are engaged in, the species of moral action that they are engaged in, is not properly called a contraceptive act, because a contraceptive act involves two things, always two things, right? The deliberate use of the sexual faculties together with the frustration of that use, right? You have to have both elements in place, okay? So the nun who takes a contraceptive pill in the Congo in case she is raped is attempting to frustrate one of her natural, well, I want to be careful about the way I put this. There's a sense in which she is attempting to frustrate one of her bodily functions. Okay, yeah, that's one thing, right? But the issue is she is not simultaneously attempting to exercise her sexual faculties. So she is not frustrating an act that she is engaged in, right? Okay. So in that sense, it's not contrary to the natural law. In that way, it's not contrary to the natural law. When somebody is raped, they are not using their sexual faculties, right? At least not in a voluntary way.
Right.
And so the kind of, maybe the best way to put it is what Suan alluded to at the very beginning of our discussion is Edward Fraser's way of talking about performative contradiction. Right? In order to get the performative contradiction, you have to have both those elements in place. You have to have the deliberate use of the sexual faculties together with the frustration of that faculty. Okay. And in that case, we don't have that here, right? Because the nun who gets raped is not deliberately using her sexual faculties. In fact, I would say she's not using her sexual faculties at all, because to use one's sexual faculties in the relevant sense requires voluntariness. So if she's raped, can she then take measures to prevent that rape from resulting in pregnancy? Well, she can't use abortifacient means under any circumstances, because even a child conceived in rape may not be murdered. But I think, right, there's nothing wrong with her attempting to prevent that rape from resulting in conception in the first place, because she never consented to the use of the sexual faculties in the first place in a way that would result in any kind of performative self-contradiction, or in the frustration of an act that she is engaged in. In that sense, right? Being raped is not a human act. It's something that happens to you. It's not something you do. Mm-hmm. And so it's not the sort of thing you can frustrate in the relevant sense, because it's not a human act. Yeah, and to whatever extent, well, let me just leave it there. It can't be frustrated because it's not a human act.
Okay, yeah, Matthew, do you want to say something, or?
Yeah, what would you say then to the Catholic moral theologians who argue that you can use a condom to prevent AIDS from transmitting in a married couple? So what they would argue is that this couple is not intending to misuse their sexual faculties in order to prevent a new life. They want to prevent the infection from being transmitted. So thereby, they're not doing anything morally wrong by using a condom.
I would say to them that they're obviously wrong, and they are dissenting from Humanae Vitae. The reason, again, coming back to what is the chosen means? Okay, you want to prevent infection. That's good. But the means you have chosen is to prevent the seminal fluid from entering the vaginal canal of the woman, and that's just what it is to contracept, right? Is to prevent this seminal fluid from getting to the point where it can fertilize an egg. Now it's true that, well, yeah, you don't you're not trying to avoid pregnancy in some sense, per se, but nevertheless, you have chosen a contraceptive means to the end, because you have chosen to prevent the seminal fluid from entering the vaginal canal, and that's just, if that's not contraception, then nothing is.
It's the same thing. It is the same thing for the nuns in the Congo. They don't want to prevent the seminal fluid, but they want to prevent fertilization. So in this sense, they're contracepting.
Yeah, but they did not use their sexual faculties.
Mm-hmm.
They never engaged in a sexual. They never. Let's put it more straightforwardly. The nuns never engaged in a sexual act. So they would be in the same position, for example, as say. I'm given to understand that sometimes contraceptives are prescribed to women for dermatological issues. I think that's the case. I don't know. Feel free to fact check me on that.
No, I've heard that before.
But let's just say, you're a young woman who is prescribed some kind of contraceptives for a dermatological purpose. Is it impermissible to take those? No, not as long as you don't simultaneously intend to use one's sexual faculties. So if I know that if I'm that young woman and I intend to be sexually abstinent in the relevant time, say because I know I'm single, and so any kind of sexual activity would be gravely wrong anyway, then I mean there's nothing wrong with that, because it only becomes a contraceptive act when there's a sexual act, right? Let's put it this way: every contraceptive act is a sexual act. The nuns were not engaged in any sexual act, therefore they were not engaged in any.
How do you define it?
The deliberate use of sexual faculties. I mean, do you need more detail than that? I'm not sure which.
Yeah, because you said that every contraceptive act involves a deliberate sexual act. So, like any cases of rape, you would just say it's not contraceptive, even if they use a condom.
In the case of rape, it would not be a sexual act on the part of the person being raped.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It would be a sexual act on the part of the rapist, because the rapist is intentionally using his sexual faculties. The woman being raped would not be engaged in a sexual act. She would just be, she's just a patient in that action. Something is happening to her rather than her doing something. She's not doing something.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything else to add, but like I just want to point out too that Christopher, you mentioned the fact that women could use contraceptives if it was like necessary for some other fact of their health, right? And so a principle of totality would be at play again in a way.
Right, and where that gets complicated, I guess, would be in cases where the woman has some kind of serious medical issue that is treated by some kind of medication that has a contraceptive effect. Mm-hmm. But where she still intends to have sex during the time that she's using that medication.
Yeah.
Because so then I think you get into really hard questions about proportionality. But in principle, this would be permissible. You know, even a married woman who intends to continue having sex can have a hysterectomy if her life is in danger, for example, even though we know that will result in her being completely sterilized, and that every sexual act she has from that point forward would be infertile. But if there were sufficient grounds for it, if it were required to save her life, then we still apply the principle of totality, and we say that it's permissible. And indeed, the consensus among moral philosophers and theologians, as far as I can tell, has been that even people who sterilize themselves with evil intention, who sterilize themselves for a contraceptive purpose, are not always under an obligation to reverse that process if it's possible, in going forward, in order to permissibly have sex in the future. So Yeah, there's a lot of hard questions here about proportionality. Yeah.
Do you think it would be wrong to sterilize pedophiles?
As a form of punishment for their crimes?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Yeah. I have serious worries about it that go back to basically the same kind of worries I have about cutting off the hands of a thief. I do have serious worries about permanently mutilating people, but I'm not willing to categorically rule it out either.
Okay.
Yeah. I think at this point, I know that we've gone on for a bit. We could maybe continue this another time, but I think we've found kind of a good place to maybe wrap up the conversation. Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if I have anything further to say. I think that I mean, I really enjoyed, Matthieu, just the creativeness that you have when you're forming these thought experiments, because I think we need people like you who are who are helping us exercise our moral intuitions and our moral reasoning as well. And so I really appreciate what you're doing, Matthieu. And I also really appreciate Christopher, just I think being a very faithful Thomist and actually kind of showing me like, oh, okay, there are nuances here that I didn't anticipate or that I didn't know about. So honestly, like I think both sides tonight or today, well, for me it's today, for Matthieu it's tonight, have really got me thinking. But honestly, at the end of the day, like I don't think any of these are like knockdown problems for natural law theory. I think that what I appreciate is that we have a system that can look at these problems and we can use its principles to start figuring out things more precisely. And precisely, you know, as Catholics too, we have the tradition of the church, the teachings of the popes and stuff to help us kind of think more clearly about these things. So yeah, I think this was a great discussion.
Yeah, we've been, I think we've been engaged in some very good casuistry in the best sense of that word. That word and that practice has gotten a bad rap over the past 2 to 3 centuries, but I think casuistry is a very good thing. And it helps clarify our moral intuitions and see where our systems of moral thought need further development or minor revisions and so forth. If we can, I would like to conclude maybe with just one more question I have for Matthieu that goes to kind of what unifies the cases that he's worried about here. And that is, I guess, just why are these the hard cases as you see it, Matthieu? Like what distinguishes these cases as being cases in which the ends justify the means from other cases as you see it where the ends don't justify the means? How can we tell? Let me put it this way. How can we tell, on your view, when the ends justify the means and when they don't?
So I don't have a systematic answer to that, but I would say something like the gravity of the consequences involved. So, not lying or telling the truth can sometimes have horrible consequences, as we saw with the Nazi and the Jews. Like torture, not torturing the terrorist can sometimes have horrible consequences. So it's mainly cases where the mean is a small evil, but it's used to prevent a greater harm. So I distinguish the things that are bad ontologically and the things that are sinful. So I think it's never permissible to sin in order to achieve a greater good, but it is sometimes permissible to do an action that is bad in itself. By that I mean ontologically, in order to avoid a greater harm. And there are, like, I don't have many exceptions, but these are just a few that I got in mind.
Okay, this might be helpful then. Maybe we can reverse roles for a minute and I can put a hard case to you. Let's say I'm Hitler's mom and I know that that Hitler is still unborn. I'm pregnant with Hitler right now. I'm Hitler's mom and I know what Hitler is going to do. Just, I don't know, fill in those details however you like, right? I don't know. God has revealed to me what my unborn son is going to do. And I can see how many lives would be saved by if I were to abort this pregnancy and kill the unborn Hitler in my womb. Permissible, impermissible? Why?
It's impermissible because it's never morally permissible to directly and voluntarily kill an innocent human being, and this mean is of a greater gravity than simply lying, which is a minor evil, compared to a direct and voluntary killing of an innocent person.
Right, but I mean, would you agree that it's in comparison with the evils done by Hitler, it's relatively minor. It's a relatively minor evil.
Sure, sure, but you don't have to take only the consequences into account, but also the means. So, like the means, some means are way more evil than others. As I said, I don't think the mean of lying is as evil or as killing, as murdering someone.
So,
and you not only have to take into account the consequences of the act, but also the means that are used. And if you have a huge difference in the consequences, but a slight minor evil in the means that's being used, then this can make a relevant difference for the hard cases.
So would I be right then in saying that on your view, there's just some point, there's some level of evil beyond which means that are more evil than that can never be justified by the ends?
Yeah, so for example, I can't kill my mom in order to save the entire city. So because the mean here is involved is too great, too big. So yeah.
Right. Okay. So I mean, I guess just as a concluding thought, I'll say that my fundamental worry about that approach to the natural law and that approach to ethics in general is that there's a big question mark there, right? About like now how evil are my means allowed to be before the ends no longer justify them? And as you admitted, I think you said, you don't have any kind of reasoned systematic answer to that question. And so it starts to look like ethics won't be a science properly so called, where we can approach ethical questions as they arise with in a systematic and scientific way. In this way, your view seems actually reminiscent, to me at least, of a view that's been popular in the 20th century called moral particularism, according to which there are no hard and fast moral principles. We have to approach each case individually and make a judgment about it in a prudent way. I know that's not, I know you do think there are some moral principles, but I guess I'm just worried about there not being a principle governing how evil my means can be in pursuing my end. And I do have, that seems very worrisome to me. And I think not something that any of the fathers or doctors of the church would have been willing to accept.
Because, just to bounce off of Christopher's thought, I remember once in one of my moral philosophy classes, we were discussing some views of ethics in the 20th century. And one of them was the view that like ethical principles are kind of like the default, but you could eventually just like, if a case gets too hard, undo or not follow through with them. And so it's just kind of like there's a general presumption to follow them, but then at some point you could defeat the presumption.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you can go.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, and I always, just from a spiritual perspective, I always worry about that kind of thing, because I think we, as sinful human beings whose intellect has been darkened in various ways, I think we find it very easy to carve out exceptions to our principles, to say, oh, yeah, generally I shouldn't do this, but this is a special case, blah, blah, blah. And that's not to say that we should be overly rigid in our understanding of what the principles are. You can go to that extreme as well. But I think we are given given our status as fallen creatures, we are generally safer adhering to moral systems that have clearer principles that can be followed at all times without having to judge hard cases from bare intuitions. I mean, for much the same reason that I think, like, Augustine, for example, tells us that total abstinence is easier than perfect moderation. For the same reason that total abstinence is easier than perfect moderation, it's also true that perfect adherence to moral principles is easier and usually safer, I think, even if it does lead us to be more rigid than we should. It's easier and safer than thinking that we're up to the task of seeing every new moral case in the way that God does and making the correct judgment about it without having clear principles to guide us in those cases. Yeah.
And I just want to be clear too, out of fairness to Matthieu, we're not saying that he, like, obviously Matthieu doesn't deny moral absolutes. I think abortion is just a clear case. No, right. But we are saying that, at least from Christopher and I's perspective, like, there are some things that we think are absolute, whereas Matthieu thinks maybe, there could be wiggle room on those things, right? And not to put, not to use belittling language, right? But we're just talking about what are the absolutes, not if they're absolutes.
Yes, well, yes, I agree. There are moral absolutes, and I'm not in favor of moral particularism. But I think that we have to avoid the temptation of trying to systematize everything, because that's what the Jesuits did with casuistry in the 16th century, and it ended up failing. I think we should use general moral principles as guides, as tools, but then see in practice if it's always reasonable to apply them to every single circumstances, and trying to illuminate your conscience, your moral conscience, by reading the text of the magisterium and things like that. It's really important. That I totally agree with. But I think it's not possible to systematize every single thing in a closed system that applies to every single situation. And I think the cases that have been brought up for lying, cases of suicide where Chris was arguing, well, if it's 5 minutes before the fire or 5 minutes after the fire, then it's permissible. You get in these sort of hyper subtle distinctions, and I don't think these are really meaningful morally. And this is where my intuition just goes beyond the principles in themselves. So
yeah, to be clear, I agree that we cannot systematize everything. So I think, for example, in our moral decision making, there is a very large role to be played by our moral intuitions and by our prudence in making judgments about proportionality, for example. And when we're applying the principle of double effect, with a lot of prudence and reliance on intuition is often required in making judgments about proportionality. I just don't think that the principle that that there's room like that for exceptions to the principle that the end never justifies the means. And I think it's also in part because I don't think that's ultimately coherent. I think that part of the reason why we want to say that the end never justifies the means and that we shouldn't do evil that good may come of it is that in a strict sense, good cannot come of evil, given the ontological situation of good and evil. That's actually a paper I hope to write relatively soon on why you shouldn't do evil that good may come of it, where the answer is that it can't in the relevant way. But the other reason I don't think there's wiggle room on that principle is because it's the object of divine revelation, and thanks to St. Paul, who tells us not to do it. and does not seem to entertain the possibility of any exceptions. So yeah, I think we're in agreement that you can't systematize everything. It's just that I think the wiggle room in our moral system, if you want to call it that, or the room for prudence and intuitions to come in, is in the place of judgments about proportionality, not judgments about whether the means could be justified by the ends.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I think we can wrap up the episode. Thank you to Christopher Tomaszewski and to Matthieu Lavagna. It was great to have you guys on. And Matthieu, what time is it over? You're Paris?
Yeah, I'm in Lyon, so it's in the middle of France. It's almost 9 p.m.
Oh, okay, so we're still at a reasonable time.
Dinner.